Hello, I'm Joe, and the Exorcist sequels are actually pretty good. Now, you may have seen the title of this video and went, you're gonna tell me Exorcist 2 is good? You're gonna look me in the eye and tell me Exorcist 2 is worth watching? No. No, dear viewer, I am not going to do that. If you haven't seen The Exorcist 2, I'm jealous. Exorcist 2 is actually really not good. And it's a shame because John Borman is actually a pretty good director, so I have no idea what happened there. Today, we're going to ignore Exorcist II and focus instead on the Exorcist III and Dominion prequel to The Exorcist. But before we get into that, welcome to Horror Month. Across YouTube, Substack, and TikTok, Project Wonder is going to spend the entire month of October putting you on to horror bangers that you may or may not have been sleeping on, but more likely you've been sleeping on. It's kind of the whole point of Project Wonder. On the Substack, we'll be doing more artsier horror movies. On TikTok, we're just going to be digging through the crates of fast channels to find some bangers you could watch for free. And on here, we're going to be looking at horror sequels who don't get their due. So if you like any of that, please subscribe to this channel, check out the Project Wonder TikTok, and click the link in our description for the Project Wonder Substack. Now, The Exorcist as a franchise has always fascinated me because nothing beyond its box office numbers says, yeah, we need to make a sequel to this one. It's a pretty self-contained story, and most of the key people are either dead or no longer possessed, and it would just be incredibly lazy to be like, Reagan's possessed again, but this time in college. Get ready for Exorcist II, co-ed creepies, which, man, that would have been a great 1985 horror movie. At the time of The Exorcist release, it was unusual for movies to get sequels at all unless they were part of like a serialized franchise, usually like westerns, detective movies, stuff like that. The concept of an Exorcist 2 was just inherently an uphill battle, and I don't know if there's any world where Exorcist 2, as released in 1977, could have worked. I think that movie was doomed from the start. If there's anything positive to say about it, it's at least Exorcist 2 is bad in an interesting way. Like, it's definitely played with some odd themes and concepts, but I don't know. Following up one of the greatest horror movies of all time with a horror movie that's not really interested in being a horror movie and doesn't quite work on its own terms, I don't know. I don't think that's really was the move. So after Exorcist 2 just basically fell flat on its face in front of the public, the franchise lay dormant for 13 years. In the interim, William Peter Blatty, the man who wrote the book that The Exorcist was based off, as well as the screenplay, wrote a sequel to the Exorcist novel called Legion. The book was a bestseller, it got some solid reviews, so obviously the production companies came through just like, hey ma, you trying to make the real Exorcist 2? And he was like, bet. But I'm a direct, and we ain't calling it Exorcist 2, or Exorcist 3, I should say. We calling it Legion. So, Blatty won the directing war, but as you can tell by the title, he lost that fight, which is going to come to bite this movie in the ass. Exorcist 3 was released in 1990, and while it did receive better reviews than its predecessor, it didn't quite light the box office on fire, nor did it become a cultural behemoth in the same way that The Exorcist did. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer really got down with it, but I don't know if that's necessarily what you want your movie to be known for, I mean, just personally speaking. Blatty's protest against the title stemmed from how poorly Exorcist 2 was received. He didn't want to be tied to that lineage, and he also just didn't want to have to carry the weight of The Exorcist. As the film faded away at the box office, the film's producers, who insisted on the Exorcist title for that good 90s SEO, admitted they fucked up with the decision. Exorcist III's reputation is entirely hurt by simply being called Exorcist 3. Even now, you probably would skip The Exorcist 3 if you just saw it on a streaming service, because why would you watch Exorcist 3 over The Exorcist? Like, I get it. And it's a shame, because taken on its own terms as a movie, The Exorcist 3 is actually pretty good. So usually I do like a beat-by-beat synopsis of what happens in the movie and give intermittent commentary like every commentary YouTuber, but we're gonna change it up for this and maybe for this month because so much of horror movies are built on their surprises, and I don't want to spoil those for you. I want you to genuinely check these movies out. There's a strong chance you haven't seen these films, and if you're an absolute dog like me, you got 31 days of horror movies coming up. So I'm hoping that after watching this, you'll genuinely consider programming The Exorcist 3 into your rotation. So The Exorcist basically laid the blueprint for every possession horror movie to come. You got a shit-talking demon, a bunch of furniture being thrown, and some genuinely upsetting imagery. The Exorcist 3 goes down a much different route. This is more of a literary horror film that's more concerned about the nature of evil and man's role in cultivating it. The possessor in this film is not like some ancient demon or Satan himself, but instead is the spirit of a serial killer who seeks to shame his televangelist father's legacy. The story follows Lieutenant Kinderman and Father Dyer, two of the main characters of the first film, who are played by completely different actors in this one because it's been like, what? It was like 15 years since the original, and just people died, sadly. They were fucking old to begin with. What'd you expect? In the time since Reagan's possession, Kinnaman and Dyer have formed a pretty strong friendship. We see them going to movies, having lunch, and having a strangely intense conversation about a fish in a bathtub. Shout out to George C. Scott, that man is doing things in this movie. The film opens beautifully with, like, clearly there's a demon in town because, like, the doors to the church blow open and you see, like, Jesus open his eyes, just like, well, hold up, we got another one in town? And after that, it turns out that, you know, it was the prelude to a murder, and whoo boy. We see Kinnaman go to the aftermath of the killing, but in a really interesting move, we don't see like the imagery, we just have Kinnaman explain how the boy was found, and this is where one of Exorcist III's most interesting strengths come into play. Show, don't tell is the rule that every person who's gone to film school or read a crappy formulaic screenwriting book has heard. Blatty shows that rules are for unconfident cowards. He is so sure of his writing, as well as the commanding yet haunting performance of George C. Scott, that quite often we don't see the grisly aftermath of the killings. We have Kinnaman describe them, and it's all the more chilling and unsettling because of it, because, I mean, he's a detective, and you're just seeing how the grisliness of this is affecting him. Early on, it's established that the killings in the film follow the MO of the Gemini killer, a serial killer of this universe who was put on death row before the events of the film. Kinnaman reveals that only the police knew the true MO of the Gemini killer, as the one they put onto the public was a fake to weed out all the crazies who want to take credit for killings that they didn't do. The Dahmer connection aside, I think fans of true crime would really enjoy sort of the procedural, serial killer-y aspects of the movie. The first half is mainly Kinnaman trying to figure out who's committing these grisly murders, and some of the visuals are elegant and how disturbing there are. There's this scene where Kinnaman approaches just a table that has neatly organized cups of blood. And when he puts two and two together, it is a genuinely chilling moment where you're just there like, oh god, how? And speaking of genuinely chilling moments, I gotta give a shout out to the horror MVP himself, the voice of Chucky, Brad Dourif, for just going off as the film's primary villain. So much of the horror is sold by Dourif just freaking owning the scene and these really tense back and forths between him and Kinnaman. And it's only heightened more by like the lighting and blocking of these scenes. Like, he is giving a performance. In terms of like haunted serial killers, it's definitely top 5. This movie is worth watching for Dourif's performance alone, I'm telling you. In contrast to Friedkin's manic, go-for-broke energy, Blatty's film is more of a restrained, elegant beast that is simple yet effective in its scares. It's more focused on creating an atmosphere of dread and suspense as opposed to just being like, huh, gotcha. And that's not to say The Exorcist was that way either. The Exorcist was just more so like the sheer ferocity and intensity of Friedkin's direction, whereas here it slows it down. It's like it's an effective slow burn. One of the most effective, and in my opinion, the highlight set piece in this is just a long take down a hallway of a nurse doing her business. And there's just this growing suspense as you know something bad's gonna happen, and you keep waiting and waiting and waiting, and then it works so well because at this point the movie has done such a good job of ratcheting up the dread that you're invested in it. Honestly, the fatal flaw of Exorcist III is the titular exorcism. See, the original version of the film didn't have one at all. And if you watch the film, the majority of it doesn't really feel like it's building to one. And in my opinion, it's a much more interesting watch because of it, because you're watching this weathered detective try to make sense of this horrific, nonsensical situation that's presented itself to him. The studio, who was so adamant the movie be called Exorcist III, thought that audiences might feel some kind of way if they went to go see The Exorcist III and there was no exorcism, which, like, yeah, but this could have been avoided by just not calling the movie Exorcist III, but what do I know? Hindsight's only 20/20. As a result of these studio mandates, the third act kind of falls flat. Like, The Exorcist is well executed as well as it can be, but it just feels so tonally at odds with the movie you were watching. The movie crushes it in making these restrained atmospheric thrills, and that kind of all goes out the window when you see an old lady going full Spider Pig in the nursing home. There's some cool imagery and the practical effects are generally good across the board, but I don't know, I just think the original ending is kind of creepier when I really think about it. As I said before, the Gemini killer's motive is to bring shame to his family's name. In the original cut, after his father died, the Gemini killer just fades away, his whole reason for perpetually existing having gone away. To me, I think that's a scarier ending. Evil ending on its own terms. Like, there was nothing anyone did. It just decided of its own volition to stop. I think if executed properly, that would have just been, would have just been like the feel-bad ending of the year. Because that's inherently a movie about failure, about essentially succumbing to forces outside of your own control. It would have shown how futile man's efforts were in confronting the metaphysical. Instead, you get a rush exorcism that takes what could have been a great horror thriller and just turns it into one that's, pretty good. Like I said, the ending isn't bad, it's just really out of left field. Like, the last 10, 15 aside, you're gonna have a great time, and honestly, I don't think the exorcism is, like, that bad. It just feels odd. It just feels like a weird ending to the movie you'd been watching, which, I don't know how to quantify that. It just feels weird. It's just weird. That's it. Not bad, just weird. But overall, I think Exorcist 3 is good in the same way that Halloween 3 is good. Neither Halloween 3 nor Exorcist 3 is trying to do the same thing as its famous predecessor. While they don't reach the masterful status of those earlier entries, they do have some interesting, unique thrills in their own right. Another point in Exorcist 3's favor is that it is incredibly easy to watch. It's free on Tubi, YouTube, Peacock. Basically, if you're watching this video, there's a strong chance you have the ability to watch Exorcist 3. So with that, let's move on to Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist. The story behind this movie is fascinating. Almost more fascinating than the movie itself. So, the idea for a prequel to The Exorcist had been in development since the mid-90s. The idea had always been to do a story about Father Merrin and his first exorcism while on a mission in Africa. The film was languishing in development hell for years and went through writer after writer, director after director, before finally settling on the script written by William Mercer Jr. and Caleb Carr and director Paul Schrader. Now, if you don't know, Paul Schrader is a beast. While he's had some misses, like every artist, his hits hit. I mean, this is the man who wrote the script for Taxi Driver, directed Blue Collar, Cat People, one of my favorite horror movies, as well, and more recently he did First Reformed and this year's Master Gardener. When it comes to folks who can make a damn movie, Paul Schrader is among them, easily. So Schrader makes Dominion, the studio sees it, and they're livid. It's not traditionally scary enough. There's not enough gore. It's not like shit your pants scary. And mind you, this movie is coming out at a weird time for horror. It's in between the transition of the teen slashers from the 90s and the J-horror remakes and torture porn that would eventually become the norm through the mid to late aughts. Honestly, Paul Schrader doing a prequel to The Exorcist made a lot of sense in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the 2000s, though, I can definitely see why this film got the reaction it did. So the studio, not liking what Schrader delivered, booted him from the process and hired Rennie Harlan, director of Nightmare on Elm Street 4, Die Hard 2, and the immediately fire Deep Blue Sea, to direct reshoots / essentially remake the whole movie. This was basically the proto-Justice League and hiring a guy to come in and completely do a whole new thing because the studio didn't like the vision of the artist they hired. It's about how Warner Brothers keeps doing that. They completely recast the film, save for Stellan Skarsgård Father Merrin, and made a gorier, more traditionally scary film. The result was Exorcist the Beginning. Released in 2004, the movie was critically lambasted and didn't even really make much at the box office. William Peter Blatty, director of Exorcist III, writer of The Exorcist, called it one of the most humiliating professional experiences of his career. But he was a fan of Schrader's version, which he thought was an elegant, classy piece of work. Exorcist the Beginning was so poorly received that Morgan Creek, the producers behind the film, decided to give Schrader $30,000 to put the finishing touches on his film and so they could release it straight to DVD. $30,000 might get you a good down payment on a house. Well, I don't know, maybe not in today's market. But, you could do some things with $30,000. Finishing a movie is not one of them. The film couldn't afford to bring back the cinematographer to properly color grade the film, so they had to approximate it himself. They couldn't afford a proper score, so Angelo Badalamenti basically just did like 14 minutes for free, as well as creating a central theme. But I also think he reused like songs from other movies he did, so the movie was very piecemeal. There's effect shots in the film that you can clearly see are unfinished. Like, the movie is ostensibly like just above an assembly cut, not quite a final cut, and despite that, it's still pretty good. So Dominion opens with a group of Nazis terrorizing a small European village after one of their own is found dead in a ditch. Merrin tries to reason with the Nazis, but you don't reason with Nazis, you just fuck their shit up. I thought we knew this by now. They give Merrin a terrible moral choice, and after this he abandons his priestly duties in favor of archaeology. But as the saying goes, you can take the man out of the cloth, but you can't take the cloth out of the man. I'm pretty sure that's a saying somewhere. Anyway, Merrin is summoned to help the excavation of a 5th century Byzantine church in Africa. Its presence is curious because it was built at a time when Christianity hadn't even made its way to Africa, so there's already something sus about there being a church in Africa. And obviously, as they unearth this church, some spooky shenanigans begin to occur, because, it's called the prequel to The Exorcist. What did you think was going to happen? They were just going to pray the whole time? Dominion is interesting in the same way as Exorcist III. It's a literary horror film that has a lot more thematic depth than you'd expect from a movie with the phrase prequel to The Exorcist in its actual title. Much like the almost there 1994 film The Shadow, it asks the question, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? From the opening, the film is completely upfront about its thesis. Is possession any worse than the evil man is capable of in its own volition? The moments that are most chilling in this movie aren't necessarily the ones of satanic panic, but when man just does something awful free of possession. That said, there is some solid supernatural spookiness in this film, and it's actually stronger than Exorcist III in that regard. So instead of just the standard, like, furniture's being moved, doors are being opened, guys talking in a weird voice, which happens later, but throughout most of the movie, the way it signals that there's something satanic going on is by showing nature being perverted. And there's a lot of scenes that just like just there's one in particular that like didn't like that, and it creates this effect of this rising like, oh god no, as you're watching it, because things are just getting like more and more effed up as the film goes on. While they couldn't color grade the film properly, it still looks really good, and I gotta give a shout out to all the actors because they're giving fantastic performances to the point where it generally feels more like a really interesting drama that happens to have some very pronounced horror elements throughout the watch. And I think that's basically why the movie didn't test well, especially when it was coming out, because it's just, this type of movie gets made a lot today. It was not being made in 2004. The thing I appreciate most about this movie is that it takes faith and evil seriously. It's not just some hokey possession flick. For the first 2 acts. Those first 2 acts, haunting, menacing, effective. And then like Exorcist III, an exorcism has to happen. I know the movie wasn't given the proper resources to be, completed. But man, this exorcism sequence is not it. Like, it in terms of the critical evaluation, I really think that last 20 minutes might have tanked any because I honestly think if like we're using Rotten as a score, which we shouldn't because we're proper film fans here, we make our own decisions about what's good and not. This really should have been in like the 50 to 60% area, but I think those final 20 minutes, man, like the physical effects look really cheap and just not well done, and that could just be because I couldn't properly color grade it. So, you shoot it one way thinking that once you play with the lighting and stuff in post, you can make it look more effective. Maybe add some digital stuff on there. They do digital VFX throughout the exorcism, and they just look really cheap and rushed. So things that are supposed to be creepy and scary just come off looking really corny and hokey. It's like you go from watching this really elegant, elevated horror movie, and then you're just immediately shot back to like some 80s era nonsense. And it's even weirder because Schrader's directorial hand is still strong through these sequences, so it's just like really elegant schlock. It's fascinating, and not necessarily in a good way. The best analogy I have, if you're a wrestling fan, is it's like watching like a really good mid-card 2 out of 3 falls match. Like if you had Drew McIntyre versus Sheamus, it's just banger to banger. You get to the 3rd fall, and then it's a DQ finish. That's the experience of watching Dominion. That really was like for 2 of my friends, but you're welcome. While the climax leaves a lot to be desired, this is still a movie worth watching because it packs a lot in the majority of its runtime that I don't think the ending necessarily discounts the entire experience, at least in my opinion. It takes the moody, atmospheric horror of Exorcist III and melds it with some of the more heightened shenanigans of the original Exorcist. Honestly, I think Dominion, The Exorcist, and Exorcist III make a pretty clean trilogy, both thematically and not necessarily in terms of quality. The Exorcist is easily the best of the bunch, a masterpiece among masterpieces, but Dominion and Exorcist III are still pretty good horror movies in their own right. It's the folly of trying to make a franchise from a movie that good. Because being a 3 out of 5 feels so much worse when you're being measured against an absolute 10 out of 10, one of the greatest to ever do it. Like, you know what I mean? It's just, yeah. Like, the Exorcist name does these movies no favors because they're pretty good, but they're discounted because, well, they're not as good as The Exorcist. And, like, a lot of movies aren't as good as The Exorcist. Having watched these, which are solid, it makes me concerned for Exorcist Believer because Halloween Ends was not my vibe, and while I liked Halloween Kills more than most, I also know that's a pretty divisive movie, so that team doing a sequel to The Exorcist, even if it's actually pretty good, I think if it's not a masterpiece on the level of The Exorcist, it's just gonna, it's gonna have the same reaction that Exorcist 3 got and Dominion got. So look forward to next year where I might have to do what Exorcist Believer is actually pretty good, if it's actually pretty good. So anyway, that does it for me today. As always, I'm Joe, and you just experienced wonder.